Journey Without Goal, the Tantric Wisdom of the Buddha, which are the teachings by Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche on the Vajrayana path. So, as always, kindly generate the intention to recognize the value of this universally and think of this study as informing the path, which is driven by the wish to temporarily provide happiness to the world and ultimately to establish all living creatures at the level of perfect freedom and enlightenment. So that's why we're doing this. So within the text, we first have a section which is all about, or rather, which is a section that is essentially a homage to the lineage, invoking the lineage, and invoking the lineage across the various traditions. So this was written by Jamgun Kongtrul Lodrutai, and together with Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo, and actually quite a number of other lamas, and even preceding them, there was a movement which we call the Rinpoche movement. But of course, around the time with Jamgun Kongtrul and Khyentse Wangpo, this movement, which was essentially very non-sectarian, or rather, which was about being non-sectarian, was then termed the Rinpoche movement. And Jamgun Kongtrul particularly facilitated the practice of this. So while there was a lot of study going on, thanks to Jamgun Kongtrul, really, this was gathered in a way that could be applied in terms of practice. So in invoking the lineage here is really invoking the eight vehicles of the practice lineage that we find in Tibetan Buddhism. Generally, we talk about the four traditions: the Nyingma, the Sakya, the Kagyu, the first it was called the Kadampa. And we'll return to this now, but then later Gelug. So nowadays we talk about these four traditions: Nyingma, Sakya, Kagyu, and Gelug. However, also this way of classifying the lineages is one way, but there are also ways of understanding the lineages in terms of the lineages of practice. And this is then where this crying to the gurus, or sometimes we call it calling the gurus from afar, invokes really the great masters of these eight, what we call the eight chariots of the practice lineage, Drupkyu Shingta Gye. So in invoking these teachers, then we've invoked the masters of the Nyingma tradition, essentially Guru Padmasambhava and Yeshe Tsogyal. And now we're invoking the masters of the Kadampa tradition, which is then what we nowadays call the Gelug tradition. And here we invoke someone called Atisha, and Atisha was really the main person that, as far as teaching goes, inaugurated the what we call the new translations and the what we also call the later spreading of the teaching in Tibet, Chidar, and also that means later spreading, and then also Sarma, meaning the later translations. So in the 9th century, the Tibetan Empire essentially collapsed, and from then on, the Nyingma tradition continued, but basically on the basis of family lineages, and yogis. The ordained, the monastics were exiled. A lot of them were brutally killed, but many, a few only really, managed to escape. And so the monastic lineage continued in Tibet, but around in the century that followed after the then collapse of the empire and so on, And this had a lot to do with the end of a brutal persecution of Buddhism by somebody called Langdama. And Langdama was assassinated, and at that time, then what was the Tibetan Empire, which extended rather widely, both towards the west and also towards the east, over towards Persia, and also way into China. This empire then collapsed, and then there's this time then where the Nyingma lineage was upheld by yogis basically, and then at the beginning of the 11th century, then from the western side of Tibet, over in the area of around Mount Kailash, a place called Toling, Guge, and so forth, there was then some kings over there who invited Atisha to come to Tibet, and Atisha had some karmic conditions, specific, and I probably won't go into them here, but anyway, this prompted him to actually be commanded to go to Tibet. And this was interestingly, this was Aryatara who commanded him to go and teach in Tibet. If you go to Bodh Gaya, then as you're entering the Mahabodhi temple on your left, there's a little row of rooms, and one of these rooms is a shrine dedicated to Tara, and in there's a little Tara that supposedly told Atisha that to purify some karma he had, he should go to Tibet and teach, which Atisha then did at the invitation of the kings of Western Tibet, Lama Changchupa, and yeah, there was some kings there. Changchupa is one name I can remember, but anyway, so Atisha traveled to Tibet, and then together with a translator called Rinchen Sangpo, then we have the beginning of a second wave of introducing Buddhism in Tibet. But we would say Atisha was very important because he really emphasized the foundations of the practice of Buddhism. So while of course, a large portion of all the teachings had been translated and were practiced, Atisha specifically was insistent on really creating the foundations of the practice in terms of particularly the Mahayana mind training. And so, so here we invoke bodhicitta and aspire that through the blessing of Atisha, then we might develop bodhicitta. So, so Atisha really is a significant character in Tibetan Buddhism. Also, sometimes we say Atisha was a manifestation of Padmasambhava. And if you read the life stories of Shabka, then there's some references in there where Atisha speaks of being an embodiment of Padmasambhava. But again, so there are various ways of seeing Atisha then as someone who really had an enormous impact on Tibetan Buddhism. And certainly to this day, really, the teachings on bodhicitta that we have in the Tibetan Buddhist traditions very much come down from the lineage of Atisha. There's a taka here to the left, where in the upper hand corner, upper section of the taka, you see the deities, 3 deities of long life, Amitayus, White Tara, and Ushnisha Vijaya, Sepame Drökar, and Namjalma. And then below you have the two main students of Atisha. One is Drumten, Jelwe Jungne, and the other is Ngok something. Sherab Jungne, possibly. I think it's Ngok Sherab Jungne. Anyway, Ngok, Ngok. So these two teachers then continued Atisha's lineage in Tibet. So here we read, "Incomparable Lord Atisha, father and son, think of me. Look upon me from amidst 100 devas in Tushita. Arouse in me bodhicitta, the essence of emptiness and compassion." So this is invoking Atisha then as residing in Tushita, the Tushita realm, which is also where the Buddha Maitreya resides. And we then supplicate Atisha to that we might generate this vast, courageous mind of bodhicitta, emptiness, and compassion. Okay. All right, so we're presently looking at mandala, and we're looking at outer, inner, and secret mandalas. And I'd like to highlight the skill of Trungpa Rinpoche in presenting this material, because what we speak about when we talk about mandala is seeing our reality in terms of purity, seeing reality without our overlay of projections. And this is the scope of the Vajrayana journey, really recognizing the intrinsic purity of all dimensions of our reality. And we do this through, and when we're talking about empowerment and the Vajrayana path, then this is very much related to what we call Father Tantra, Mother Tantra, and non-dual Tantra. And in the Nyingma context, we refer to this as the inner tantras, Maha, Anu, and Ati. But these mandalas, or rather these three sections of Tantra, they correspond to what we could call outer, inner, and secret. And the first section of the Father Tantra or Mahayoga is very much about the outer mandala, the way that we see our world in general. And there are some quite specific instructions on that. So this is where we introduce to the notion of deity in mandala, basically pure perception. And so we can get quite specific about that. The two next empowerments and the scope really of the Mother Tantra is about the more unseen dimension of our being, our body, and our emotions. And the last one, which is then the scope of the fourth empowerment, Ati Yoga or Mahamudra, which is very much about the mind. But where we could talk about this in terms of method, and it could get very exotic and very sort of amazing, Trungpa Rinpoche very sensibly actually speaks, what is this really about? And so that's where here we're talking about, like last time, we're talking about quite simply some very domestic experiences about us relating to our world around us. And that is what really we need to begin to think when we talk about, let's say, the scope of the Mahayoga of Father Tantra in terms of seeing the world as a mandala. It could sound it could sound truly amazing and interesting, and we'd love to do that. We'd love to see the world as a mandala, and we'd love to sit down and visualize all of this. The thing is, there's a point to it, and it's not really that it's about us being entertained. It's about, or us sort of having a sort of a nice way to relate to the world, but it's really based on our, first of all, founded on us liberating and working with our already existing experience with the world. So we need to begin where we are. And this is again where Trungpa Rinpoche, knowing the modern world and how we see the modern world, rather than sit down and say, okay, this is the practice, he sits down and say, look, we're going to look at the neighborhood in which this practice is taking place. This is where it fits. This is the antidote for an existing condition. But we first need to recognize what that condition is. And that's where it's very helpful when we're talking about mandala, that we first begin to talk about how we're actually experiencing mandala presently. So we looked at this last time, and continuing then, Trungpa Rinpoche says, when we relate directly to the world, we can see that there is a thread of continuity. We can see the setup as a whole rather than having only a partial view. According to the Buddhist path, there's nothing other than the whole world. Therefore, we could say that the tantric attitude toward reality is non-theistic. In the non-theistic to reality, the world is not divided between God and the devil. The world is a totality in itself. It has its own muscles, its own brain, its own limbs, its own circulation. The world has its own water system, electrical system, and sewage system automatically built in. They're already there. The problem we face is that we do not see the totality. We do not acknowledge it. We do not even get close to it to see that it is actually true. So traditionally, we think of traditionally when we talk about spirituality, then we think, oh yeah, there's a sort of divine realm, and then there's the humane realm, and we have this split between what is divinity, what is humanity, what is sublime, and what is secular. And so there we have this split that has nothing to do with what we do in Buddhism. In Buddhism, we're about relating to what we immediately experience. We're not bringing in some philosophy that's beginning to try to construct the world according to how we think it might be, and so on. There's no metaphysics involved. There is relating to the stuff, the substance of the world. And that's why Trungpa Rinpoche talks about this as non-theistic, and very much about us beginning to relate to the world wholeheartedly without trying to classify it and without trying to distance ourselves to it. It's about us beginning to relate directly to it. So this is what's implicit then when we're talking about the outer mandala. And he continues, we're not talking about the totality of the world in the sense that everything should be good and perfect and fantastic, and nobody should acknowledge anything bad. We're talking about reality in which good is made out of bad and bad is made out of good. Okay, let's just, before we go, continue with that, because that's the sort of standard Buddhist, you could say, logic that sometimes can trip us up. And it really just means that we're not talking about how the world should be, right? Because when we begin to talk about how the world should be, people should be sensible. People should do the right thing, and people should do the good things and not the bad things. They shouldn't act stupidly. Then we're already actually beginning to construct what it should be. And these constructions, they're entirely relative. There's no real right and wrong. Things happen. And that's where when we're talking about totality, it's about us embracing what is rather than what should be. So this is an important point, really. So when we're talking about mandala, we're not sitting there saying, this is how we, according to our political conviction, this is how the world should be. And those who disagree, they're bad. And what we're aiming for is the good. Good is entirely just our concept of something that stands in opposition to what we don't like. So good is made out of bad, and bad is made out of good. We construct these concepts in relation to the other. So the concept of good only exists on the basis of bad, and vice versa. Okay. But this is an important point, because that's really where we begin to get into what we call this and that, which is duality. That's where we begin to talk about light as opposed to dark, long as opposed to short. And they all just exist relatively. There's no ultimately long stick. There's no ultimately short. There's no ultimately, it all stands in relation. And similarly, also these concepts of good and bad. And this is an important point. It's important for us to not just say, oh, the Buddhists say these strange things. Yeah, that's probably right. We should actually go a bit further, and throughout our day, we should see how we make up this, like we don't like something, and we see that not liking is because we wanted it to be in a different way, which it hasn't turned out to be. But we nevertheless are fixated on how it should have been. We should see in our everyday life, we should make it into our homework to actually see how we create these dichotomies. And they're entirely based on our labeling. It actually has nothing to do with reality. So we are, like Trungpa just says up on the top of the page here, we do not even get close to it to see that it is actually true. So this is where we're beginning to expand our horizons, and it won't be about us having chanted a lot of mantras. It won't be about us being able to parrot Buddhist phrases or even sort of being able to expound something Buddhist. It's about us actually beginning to go, this happened, now I'm going to work with what it is, rather than saying, this shouldn't have happened. This person is stupid. These people are stupid. They do stupid things. You know, that's where we fail to see that we have a reality, and we're putting the label stupid on the basis of how we think they should have been. So we're continually operating within a world where we make good and bad, and hence we're not really touching this totality. Trungpa Rinpoche's point here is, if we're beginning to approach the world for what it actually is, we need to do so embracing it rather than having this censorship that continually happens in terms of what we want and what we would have liked it to be. So that's where, as we experience the world, therefore, the world can exist in its own good-bad level, its self-existing level of dark and light, black and white, constantly. We're not fighting for either of those sides. So we're going to have messy situations, and sometimes things are going to go terribly good, yes. But we're going to be working with these situations as they are. So, sorry, I'm keep interjecting commentary, but this is actually a really significant paragraph. Anyway, Trungpa Rinpoche continues. Whatever there is, favorable or unfavorable, it is workable. It is the universe. That is why, in the Tantric tradition, we talk about the world or the cosmos in terms of mandala. Mandala is a totality. It has a universal quality. That totality is not a compromise, as if someone were to say, if you tone down your badness and I tone down my goodness, we will have a happy medium, with both good and bad toned down to a gray level. That kind of compromise is not a totality. It's just gray and depressing. In fact, that is one of the depressing aspects of some of the ecumenical movements taking place in this country and the rest of the world. They seem to be based on the feeling that everything should be okay and that everything is good. Badness should come up to the level of goodness, and goodness should come down to the level of badness, so that we can have some kind of happy medium. In that approach, there could be communist Buddhists and Nazi tantric practitioners, but somehow that does not work. It's too silly. So us trying to sort of find a middle way, sometimes we're thinking of it in terms of being less one way, or things should be less one way or another. That's not what we mean with the middle way in the Buddhist context. When we talk about the middle way, we're talking about us actually beginning to be fully present with reality as it is, without diminishing it according to our particular, what we call extremes, trying to pigeonhole reality as existing or non-existing and so forth. We're extracting ourselves from our insecure practice of trying to label reality. And that's where what Trungpa Rinpoche here is proposing, that we go beyond that. And this is where we're beginning to embrace the world with all its various aspects. And so that's where toning things down is not at all going to have anything to do with trying to arrive at something that's acceptable, or some sort of totality. This sort of a toned down, bland, depressing, happy medium. That's not the solution. So here then we've discussed the outer mandala, and in doing so, Trungpa Rinpoche introduces something that has to do with our immediate experience of how we relate to the outer world. And before we get into talking about visualizing mandalas in terms of deity and so forth, we first need to be intimately and humbly aware of our tendencies. That's where we begin. The path should be a remedy for the tendencies that drive our confusion. And this is where the tantric path is incredible, because it begins with recognizing the purity of our reality. And for us to venture into that reality, we're going to first begin where we are in terms of recognizing what it is that veils this greater reality. So, inner mandala. Trungpa says we have been talking about the external world, or the world of perceptions, as a mandala that we are able to work with. The second type of a world is the body, which is known as the inner mandala. This mandala is connected how we handle our bodies in terms of our awareness or sense of reality. Now again, just to put this into perspective, this is then where the first section, the outer mandala, is then, for those who practice Vajrayana, this is associated with what we call the outer mandala of deity and the world. And this is basic to the outlook of everything, really. So it's the foundation. More subtly, then, we speak of our reality in terms of our body and relating to our sensitivity to what is happening within our body and our emotions. So that's a more subtle dimension of our reality. And also we do, when we talk about Tantra, we talk about these in terms of female and male. But the male is more about the sort of the outer world, and the female realm is more about the body and the awareness of what's happening internally. So of course this does not particularly have to do with gender as such, but is more to do just with domain. And of course this is one way of classification, but it really corresponds to something that's present in any one of us. We're all equally male and female in that regard. Then again, there are some places where we can identify some styles of neurosis or some styles of disposition that might be reflected in gender. But anyway, then we refer to the inner mandala as being more the realm of the female and the outer mandala being more the realm of the male. So hence these terms, Father Tantra and Mother Tantra. So Trungpa continues, developing awareness is quite deliberate. In the beginning, we might feel that working deliberately with the body is too exaggerated a form of behavior. However, it seems to be necessary. We have never regarded our body as sacred property. The attitude of sacredness has been neglected, particularly in the Western world. Instead, life is regarded as a hassle. We were born breastfed or bottle-fed and put into diapers. Those were our unpleasant facts of life. Now we can go to the toilet and drink our cup of tea. How victorious we are. We view it as a victory that we have survived all that. But we have not actually developed any art in our lives. We do not know how to care for our bodies. So again, this is where there's a sacred dimension that we miss in terms of our physical reality. And of course, now we can do things that we couldn't do when we were small, but still very often our bodies are just taken for granted and we become very sloppy and careless and essentially very unaware in that dimension that has to do with our body and implicitly also then the dimension of our experience. So Trungpa then continues, taking care of ourselves is regarded as an enormous hassle. Getting up at a certain time, writing checks, going to the bank, going to a restaurant, and all are done humorlessly. Perhaps our only delight is to get drunk at a party. We have a fantastic time dancing with our partner, whoever it may be, and then we peacefully pass out. That is a very crude way of handling our bodies. There's no dignity in that, none whatsoever. So again, this is really just this practice, and this of course happens across all cultures, where ordinary persons without any sense of the sacred dimension of their existence then basically kill time, just get through life without any awareness or any vision, without any dignity. Trungpa Rinpoche continues, we may have been taught sophisticated table manners by our aristocratic parents. They may have taught us how to drink, how to use forks and knives, and how to sit properly and make good conversation. Still, there is some fundamental crudeness involved because we have been taught a facade rather than what should be felt. We could be extremely well-mannered and able to pass through diplomatic circles immaculately and impeccably. Nevertheless, there could still be a crudeness of fundamentally not knowing how to relate with our cup of tea, our plate, our table, and our chair. Trungpa Rinpoche continues, there are enormous problems with thinking that we can only trust in that we were told rather than in how we feel. When we have been told how to handle ourselves, our behavior can become automatic. Automatically, we pick and choose. We learn to be perfect actors. It does not matter how we feel. We might be in tears, but still we put on a gleaming smile and make polite conversation. If we cannot find anything good to talk about, we just talk about the weather. With that approach, we become very crude. In fact, we're trying to become perfect actors rather than real people. What's implicit here is, of course, when you live with no vision and there is no purpose really to your existence, when you're just seen as just a bleep in the universe, then of course there is no sense of a reality that we could connect to. And in that sense, we're just mimicking particular culturally imposed conventions in terms of how to behave and how to be. And this is of course not just talking about, you could say, the squares, the sort of the people in the establishment, but this also goes across in the most sort of cool, hip context also, where we just live by particular conventions and act according to some very strictly set out parameters of what's cool and what's not cool, what's acceptable and not acceptable. So all the time just mimicking rather than actually being in touch. So of course, this comes down to just simple lack of vision and simple lack of, or not simple, but a lack of vision and a lack of understanding of our reality and of our potential. Some students of meditation have a similar problem. They have been told to keep a good posture, and that the more a person keeps perfect posture, the closer he or she is to enlightenment. If one takes that approach, without a sense of personal connection, it can produce a situation similar to that of the children of aristocracy who are taught to have good table manners. In both cases, there is a body problem, an actual physical problem, which has nothing to do with politics or society. Again, we sit perfectly, and it's just like we have good table manners. So Trungpa Rinpoche continues, the tantric tradition is fundamentally an intentional approach to life in terms of how we handle our body, how we speak, how we look, how we touch our cup, our fork or knife, how we lift things and carry them out. All those things are very deliberate, but such deliberateness is not presented in a manual or book on how to act according to the tantric tradition. The point is, there's no such a thing as a real tantric diet or proper tantric behavior. Instead, we develop a basic attitude so that we can begin to extend our arm, so that when we begin to extend our arm, we simply do it. When we begin to touch, we touch, and when we lift in a very confident way. We just do it. We have a real experience of confidence. There is no tantric finishing school designed to train people for the tantric aristocracy or to develop a deceptive but well-mannered king. The tantric approach to body, how to handle our body and our sense perceptions, how to look, how to feel, how to listen, how to handle the whole situation, is very personal and real. So again, this comes down also a lot to do with our vision and also a grounding in an understanding of the first outer mandala, which is beginning to identify the sacred nature of our reality. But within that, then there's no notion of how should you behave. You know, we of course are talking about a dimension of mindfulness and being connected with our body, but there's also a sacred dimension. And that's where we're operating from a place of confidence and not about behavior. So again, this is not about that there's a particular way to do things, but there's very much a question of beginning to relate to our bodily situation, who we are and how we do things. So Trungpa just says Tantra is deliberate, but at the same time, the heart of that deliberateness is freedom. The crazy yogins of the tantric tradition were not people who just hung out on street corners doing their crazy things. The freedom of Tantra is something very real, very dignified and Vajra-like. The sense of indestructibility is always there. There is intention, there is reality, and there are constant discoveries. So again, this is where this term, particularly in recent years in the media and so on, crazy wisdom and the idea of crazy might imply that you just do what you like, and you're very much, the implication is that there's a sort of frivolity, that you're doing what you feel like, and that's not the tantric nature at all. And the crazy here means freedom from boundaries in the sense of conventional duality, but it's completely void of any kind of self-centering or serving the sort of frivolous agendas of self-centering. So in that sense, the tantric crazy wisdom comes from discipline. It comes from being connected, and it comes from bodhicitta. It comes from being awake. And that's relating with reality. And the tantric actions themselves, they emerge organically in a based on context. And so there's discoveries in the sense that there's no script, there's no kind of plan or style, particularly even. All the various tantrikas are very unique in their own way of doing things, and the actions themselves are not just based on who they are, but more as compassionate and wise response to particular situations. So this is talking a lot about the dimension of body and us inhabiting our body, but we're talking about inhabiting then the body in an awake sense. Okay, secret mandala. Then we have the third world, which is the secret mandala, or the mandala of the sacred realm. The sacredness or secretness of this mandala are not based on our being highly evolved and consequently looking down upon the outer mandala and the inner mandala. Rather, the secret mandala consists of simplifying our psychological behavior, our meditative behavior, into a sense of awareness and openness in which we have no hesitation, none whatsoever, in dealing with our emotions. So the secret mandala has to do with the fourth empowerment, has to do with non-dual tantra, Ati and Dzogchen, and it's also very much founded on the actual experience of meditation, sitting practice. So where there's a beginning of dawning of this simplicity that does not mean simple-mindedness, but just simply being present, being aware, being connected, and actually living our life based and informed by clarity, our psychological clarity. And that's where this clarity is not about eliminating our emotions or what arises in the mind, but just having a straightforward relationship with our psychology. So Trungpa says, in the secret mandala, emotions are all interwoven and interconnected. Passion is connected with aggression. Aggression is connected with ignorance. Ignorance is connected with envy or jealousy, and so forth. There is a continuous web taking place that is quite obvious and real. Therefore, a person at the tantric level should not regard any one emotion as a big deal, but all emotions are a big deal. All the emotions that exist in a person's mind are the same problem, or the same promise for that matter. They contain the seed of freedom or liberation as well, the seed of imprisonment. In the secret mandala, we work with all our hidden corners, any little areas of irritation. In fact, those things that we regard as little problems may actually be our biggest problems. Those problems are completely interrelated, which is the notion of mandala here. So again, this is the scope that right from the moment that we enter the Buddhist path as practitioners, where we begin to become increasingly awake, or we begin to become conscious, and we begin to no longer just latch blindly onto our impulses, but we begin to be aware of where these impulses come from. There we see the entire array of who we are is just a continual web or collection of our psychological material, all of which are basic to how we interact with the world. So it's not as if any of these things there's some hierarchy of lesser and importance. And of course, when we're working with that, the problem is we tend to fixate on things to a lesser or greater degree. Of course, the way that we fixate on things again is very habitual. So all of this is taking place within a realm that ordinarily we ignore. But as practitioners then of meditation, having done sitting practice, we come into this most intimate and, you could say, the least conspicuous area of our being, which is then the secret mandala. But this is very much really what lies as the ground of who we are. So this is where we engage with this with an openness and a consciousness, which is not about choosing one above the other, but just connecting with it. Trungpa says there is a sense of continuity in our emotions and a sense of openness at the same time. For instance, we lose our temper, we become outraged, we're about to strangle our partner, and in fact we begin to do so. That itself is a mandala display. We feel angry, we feel passionate, we feel jealous, we feel ignorant. All those things are happening at once. That is real experience. There is no how to do it. We did it already. That is our chance. In fact, that is our golden opportunity. We have manifested the secret mandala already. So we might be unconscious about what we are actually experiencing, and yet we're all the time driven by experience. And sometimes the way we begin to identify experience is when they really become manifest. Of course, experience happens all the time on a more or less subtle level. And this isn't what we're talking about here is not how should I actually then do things? Please let me know. This is the easy part. Somebody says, oh yeah, you should behave like this and you should do that. And that of course is the whole, you could say, comedy of just sticking to behavior. But that's not the point. It's not about what we're doing. It's about us being aware of what we are and being aware and conscious about what is our given conditions. So this is what the scope then, this is then the scope then of this secret mandala. Trungpa continues, on the other hand, we usually do not acknowledge or experience our emotions properly. When we need release, we might make love. When we need release, we might kill someone. That is not quite the proper way to approach our emotions. Exploding on the spot is not the way to express emotions directly. Emotions are sacred. They should be regarded as real and obvious things that can teach us something. We should regard them properly without getting off on something or other. We might say, I'm bored, let's go to the movies. That's not quite the way to deal with our boredom. So we sometimes have this notion that I'm being true to myself, or I'm being very direct, somebody who's very rude and insensitive and essentially just out of touch with what's going on and just caught up in their own head and their own agendas. They might say, well, I'm just a very direct person. I'm blunt and direct. But actually, this has nothing to do with being direct. And it is really just what Trungpa says here. It's just getting off. So it has nothing to do really with recognizing or being conscious of our psychological material, and particularly not being conscious of it in the sense of understanding how key it is to our being and how it really has this dimension of something sacred. And that's again where we actually, for a large part of the time, we're trying to avoid being who we are. We might just like to be distracted. We might want to be just entertained. So Trungpa continues, the tantric approach to emotions is much more disciplined and much more personal. It is highly personal. That is why this mandala is called the sacred mandala. It is very difficult to achieve, but it's also very important and extremely sacred. Normally, no one is able to achieve such perfection or even to conceive of such possibility. So we should respect the sacredness of the secret mandala. And we could say this is sacred because this is the very ground of our being. It's the most inconspicuous aspect. It's sort of the bias or the very ground place in which we have a headquarters that controls everything. So in that this is the place where the very core of our awakened quality exists. It's the most sacred and most subtle of the dimensions of our being. The mandala principle is an important concept in the tantric teachings. The outer mandala is connected with the external world, how to relate to society, politics, organizations, domestic relationships, and so forth. The inner mandala is connected with our body and how to handle it. The secret mandala is connected with how to deal with our emotions. We have to incorporate all three mandala principles simultaneously in our experience. We can't separate them. We can't practice each of them separately at different times. We have to do it all at once. In that way, things become much more real. So this then sums up the notion of mandala. And of course, mandala implies that there's an outlook that sees the intelligence of these dimensions. So this is where we're talking about mandala as a sacred principle. And that's where then the way that we connect on the levels of outer, inner, and secret is continually connecting with the reality of things. It's not retreating into some dream world. Now, Trungpa talks about how all of these work together. This is a bit like all the way through the Buddhist teaching. We talk about how we need to have both the dimension of wisdom and compassion, or wisdom and skillful means. There's the nature of things, but then there's also the way that we work with the conventional aspect of things in terms of method. And so we're continually operating with the various skillful means in the sense of connecting this with reality. And so likewise also with the mandala principles that we talk about here, these outer, inner, and secret practices that we have throughout the various empowerments, they continually operate within the scope of the same vision. It all operates within this vision of sacred outlook. Of course, the emphasis might be a little bit different. So we have the practices and the view and the practice according to the different tantra sections, but they should be understood that they all operate with a similar or with a united vision. Trungpa says the mandalas are reality. It's as simple as that. Of course, reality is real, but our contact with reality is through our sense perceptions, our body, and our emotions, the three mandalas. The three mandalas are what we meet or mate with reality. When we put our finger on a hot stove, it is our perceptions that get burned by their meeting with reality. We have to communicate with reality. Otherwise, there is no reality. We might try to get out of the whole thing by saying, who cares? But that becomes reality at the same time. We cannot get away from it. It's very personal. It's very haunting. It's all over the place. So in the rather unimaginative context of dogmas and philosophies that try to create labels and distance ourselves from reality through analysis, but lacking actually the method for actually experiencing reality, then we actually are sometimes thrown back into reality. We burn our fingers. We might have a very advanced philosophy about how things are, but then we burn our fingers and we collide with reality. And that of course we might say, well, you know, I won't relate to reality, then I won't have a philosophy. But that again, that's ends up being a philosophy in itself. It's like people who say, well, I believe in nothing, you know, people become agnostics and so on. But then that's a whole dogma also in itself. So at the end of the day, we're continually living with reality. And of course, what we're then implying with mandalas is that we could begin to see this reality not as a problem, but actually discovering its sacred dimension. Okay. Jakob, could you quickly explain what's the mudra Tisha doing with his hand? It's called the teaching mudra. Yeah, yeah, like that. If Kadampa is now called Giluk, then why are there still Kadampa centers? Oh well, the the Giluk tradition still very much identifies with the Kadampa, heritage. But there's something else that's come up in recent years. And this is, of course, part of the issue with Tibet, where there's been some partly it's inherent to the you could say some of the troubles that we've had in Tibet with some of the it's sort of a Tibetan problem with particular practices, and that's where within the Gelug tradition in the present day, some practitioners wished to practice a particular way that the Dalai Lama said, please don't do that. And so then they sort of went off and they have then what they call the new Kadampa. Of course, those who sympathize with the Dalai Lama would say, that's not so nice. And these people get pretty antagonistic about the Dalai Lama. So it's one of these sort of little awkward family squabbles that we have within Tibetan Buddhism, these people who call themselves new Kadampas. Yeah. Also, of course, new Kadampas have then been funded by those who wish to weaken the Dalai Lama's position, which is, of course, a part of a larger political game. But so that's where you would come across some centers that call themselves Kadampa in the modern context. But again, Kadampa is a very respectable, it's traditionally a very respectable lineage, and that is then where the Gelug tradition comes from. Is anyone having a problem with the sound? It's glitching out on my end. Okay. I can't help you with that. It seems there are times when so-called Vajrayana practitioners may be getting off while thinking they're displaying crazy wisdom. Well, let's say these are not Vajrayana practitioners, but they're people who might like to justify their self-indulgent behavior saying they're Vajrayana practitioners, or they might think they might have some delusional airs of grandeur thinking they are Vajrayana practitioners. Yeah? So, you know, it's like people who get caught speeding. They might be thinking that they're Formula One race drivers. Perhaps, perhaps this is one way that the path is not obvious to navigate, but requires practice and guru guidance. Yes, exactly. We can't approach the Vajrayana without really all the conditions for the path being there, and that is why we practice the preliminaries, the Nundra. Yeah. Then sound is fine now. Good. I remember Rinpoche saying something along the lines of, all we beings have is beliefs. I think that relates to what you said last about dogma. Thank you. Yes, that's the thing. We continually operate within the relative world. We operate with these beliefs, and that's where we get stuck. So, of course, what we're doing in terms of the path is, you could say, weaning ourselves off beliefs and making our mind more and more open. Of course, we still need to operate with the skillful means of the path. So we still need to operate within a relative reality. But that's the beauty of the Buddhist teaching. Then we take this relative truth and we make it a vehicle for extending beyond this relativity. And then someone says, sound has been great throughout. Thank you. I'm glad to hear that. Okay. There's 5 minutes left if anybody has more questions. Can you say more about inner, outer, and secret working simultaneously? I can see the relation of outer and inner, but I'm confused of secret. It's really just degrees of conspicuousness of our world. So we have a very solid, apparently heavy, real outer world, which is the world in our, our world. And then we have the more vulnerable, more soft aspect of our body. And then there's the inconspicuous, the intangible dimension of what really actually is that through which we experience everything, which is the secret mandala, which is then the dimensions that is very often obscured by the whole play of our when we get obscured when we fixate on the play of this intangible inner mind. So essentially we could say that the outer, inner, and secret is the outer world, the body, and the mind. I hope that makes sense. Well, certainly within the context of Tantra, then we continually come back to these outer, inner, and secret levels. Yeah. Sometimes we talk about outer and secret obstacles. We would say outer obstacles have to do with things going on in the outer world. Inner obstacles have to do with illness, and secret obstacles have to do with our neurosis. So, yeah. I have this worry about if I died before I finish the Nindro, what will happen to me in the Bardo? Well, we're on the path. And so we're continually connecting with a dimension of openness. And so that's where the degree to which we apply ourselves to the path will be able to handle the Bardo skillfully. But we will continually be on the path. Even if we complete the Nindro, we're still going to continually be working. So we're always on one Nindro of some sort or another. So it's really about if we die before we attain enlightenment. So until then, we necessarily are progressing, and every little step of the way is going to facilitate and enable us to handle the situation of Bardo more skillfully. And also it should be said that Bardo is not just what happens to us when we pass away. Bardo is what happens with us right now. For example, this class will finish. Then you're in a Bardo before the next event in your life is going to be happening, whatever it might be. So that's where there's a gap. And we're continually relating to these gaps before things happen. And as they begin to play out, we sustain recognition of what in the Bardo is then described as the clear light. We try to stay clear of our usual downward spiraling patterns of neurosis and try to sustain a vision that is meeting whatever we encounter with meditation. So that's where we right now are training for the Bardo. So what is going to happen when we physically pass away is very much reflected in what's happening right now in this moment as we pass from situation to situation. Hi Jakob, where do we find this class recorded? So my dear friends, as I often repeat, when I send out this email to you, try and read it. There is a place where it says to register, click on this link. To access the recordings, click on that link. So there's 2 links that are sent out in this email that you've received initially, and you have 2 links, one for registration, one for the recording. If you have lost that email, just shoot me a mail, and I'll resend the mail. Yeah. So, thank you. Are the 5 skandhas within the secret mandala? The last 4, but they sort of work. They work throughout the skandhas work throughout the 3 mandalas. So we would say whatever we experience in terms of the outer world, in terms of the elements and so on, they're reflections of the mandala. And very much we talk about this in terms of the consorts that are based on the subject and object. And so that's where we talk about seeing the outer world and all our perceptions in terms of the mandalas of the 5 Buddhas, the purity of the 5 skandhas and the purity of the perception of the 5 skandhas. So somebody says, apologies, I joined late. Who's the person pictured today? So as we were chanting the crying to the gurus from afar, today it was about Atisha, and Atisha, who is the founder of the Kadampa tradition. So this is Atisha. Yeah. So there's a lot to be said about Atisha. He was a wonderful teacher, and his life story also is quite interesting. Is being in the present open to the reality of now and meditating on, focusing on an image of a deity, focusing on an image of a deity or Buddha similar? Yes, because this is beginning to see the purity. This is our entrance to through the devotion and through the appreciation of the sanity of the teacher. The deity really unlocks our ability to relate to ourselves and to reality without the preconceptions of our ordinary confusion. So the devotion to the teacher and the deity is really what is key then for the practice of deity. And as such, deity is a way to integrate this experience. So it's not just about us having a particular visualization, even though that can help, but it's more than anything to mingling with the teacher's wisdom and the teacher as inseparable from the deity. This enables us to integrate this consciousness or awake quality within all our experience. So as long as there is mind awakening, i.e. no more concepts, well, the degree to which we have concepts, we're still imposing some barrier, but as we're practicing, we're less and less fixating on concepts, and we touch reality more and more directly. But we on the path, we're very skillfully still integrating concepts and ways of integrating all the aspects of our being. So I'm grateful to share this bardo with you and everyone. And me too, thank you. Could this lockdown that the world is experiencing to varying degree be considered a collective bardo? Yes, lockdown, no lockdown, we are all very much having what we call shared perceptions. We each have our own perception of the world, but then again, we are sharing a lot of concepts and a lot of ideas. So our experience right now is wherever we go, we seem to be thrown in there with a lot of other entities, and we sort of more or less operate within a shared reality. Somebody says, thank you. Today's class clarifies a lot for me, but also confuses me even more. So that's the good news and the bad news, I guess. Ideally, should one address our neurosis before beginning the Vajrayana? Oh, we're from the very start, the whole Buddhist path is about addressing our neurosis. So regardless of where we are, we will be addressing our neurosis before, during, and after Vajrayana. So, well, certainly before and during. And honestly, we should never think, oh, I should have prepared myself better. That's okay. Wherever we are, we're doing okay. So we just keep going, but certainly the nature of everything we're doing is dealing with our neurosis all along. Yeah. That's thanks to neurosis, we can begin to have some sense of liberation. There's not going to be a liberation that's not about us external to our neurosis. So every time that we're just a little bit patient or a little bit not held by our neurosis, we begin to have some freedom from the grip and the tyranny of our neurosis. So neurosis is very much the key for us discovering further freedom. This is not about us, looking back at our life and our career as practitioners and thinking I should have done things differently. It's about just what's happening right now. Right? Thanks from Chile. Okay, thank you. All right, we'll conclude at this point, I think. Through this virtue, may all beings throughout existence awaken together without a single being left behind. In the pure realm of the luminous essence, the ground of the great perfection, may they remain inseparable from the kayas and wisdoms. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we are born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together.